my website information, but I put this up as well, if you can see it. It's very important to me that you have this URL to my website, because I've labored so hard to put up all kinds of valuable information in terms of politics, security issues, everything that concerns Israel, and some things that concern Americas that impinges on Israel as well. I urge you to visit my website, to bookmark it, to come back to it for information, and to share the information with others.
We'll put your website in the chat, so anybody who wants to copy it can copy it.
My whole goal in doing this is for people to use the information, and the more people who use it, the happier I am. That's what I want. That's all I ask.
That's why you're doing it.
Okay. People write to me sometimes, my readers, and they ask me a question, a prediction, and sometimes I answer, my crystal ball isn't working today. So I have to tell all of you, my crystal ball is not working, not just today, but yesterday and tomorrow as well. What I am finding, and I've spoken to other analysts who are saying the same, is that we're living in times of such huge flux that you think something is going to happen and it slides out from under you and something else happens. Like I just saw a question about E1, and is something going to happen? They're talking about it. Is something going to happen? I don't know. I wouldn't hold my breath, but they're talking about it. And that's the way a lot of things are. Now, I'm making the assumption that most of you are very well-informed people. And if I touch upon some things that you know already, you'll forgive me, but I think certain basics are necessary. I hardly have to tell any of you, we're living in hard times. And I want to begin with an overview of what's going on. And then I have a specific focus that I want to do from there. In the US, there's an obvious, terrible movement to the left. We see it in the administration with Biden and with Blinken and their embrace of the two-state solution. Biden has reversed Trump policy so that he no longer holds the feet of the P8 to the fire. He is now back to giving with no demand for accountability, which is very bad. They can continue to pay their, pay for slave, pay their terrorists and all the rest of it, and they can get their money anyway. One issue on the table right now has to do with a consulate that's on a Grove Street in Western Jerusalem. It used to be used as a quasi embassy for the PA, and Trump killed that. And there was no longer the case, and it became a regular consulate that answered to the embassy. And now Biden is talking about reverting back to this. And this is a bad thing. We have indicated to the Biden administration, we don't want this to happen. I think if push comes to shove and Biden insists upon it, we could stop it technically, but I think Bennett probably wouldn't stop it, but we would be very discontent with it. This signals unofficially that somehow the Palestinian Arabs have a piece of Jerusalem too. Any mission from the US to the PA belongs on PA territory in Ramallah. It doesn't belong in Jerusalem. In terms of Congress, of course, that's also moving left. And I'm not just talking about the squad, which is horrendous, far, far left, radical, anti-Israel. The entire center is moving left. And this is what I find scary. Congress people are always looking over their shoulders to see who's watching them. And there's a lot of pressure from quote unquote progressive left-wing organizations pushing them in the left-wing direction. And I want to mention specifically, I'll take questions later, right? I'm not supposed to answer these now, am I? No. Okay. Specifically, Congressman Andy Levin of Detroit. He just promoted the Two-State Solution Act. And he admits we can't have a two-state solution now, but he wants to keep things fluid enough so that if it happens in the future, it's still possible. And what he's proposing is that American funds not be used for settlement building or taking down illegal housing in Area C or any of the thing. They want to keep it like status quo so they can move ahead with 2 states later. He says he's pro-Israel. It depends, in my book, it depends on how you define pro-Israel. J Street was with him when he made his announcement. J Street would say they're pro-Israel too, and I will say they're not. Again, it depends on your interpretation of what you see as good for Israel. And by the way, Ted Deutsch of Florida is also on board with this, and there are others as well. And this is something that has to be watched. Here in Israel, as far as I'm concerned, the government is a horror. It's, I'm sure you all know, it's a pastiche of different factions from left to right with so many different political positions that it prevents any meaningful action on any of the major issues. The greatest concern of all, and not the only concern, is Mansour Abbas's Ram Party. That's the United Arab List. They have 5 mandates and they're in the government. And I want to make clear, I don't object to Arabs in the government. I object to Arabs who are not Zionists in the government. These guys are anti-Zionists. They are jihadists in their sympathies. And they're playing it cool now because they want to get certain things. But that's where he is and that's where he stands. And it's very worrisome. And he packs a wallop in terms of influence because everybody's afraid he's going to bolt. And if he bolts, the coalition goes down. There's only 61 in the coalition and it's razor thin and they're trying to keep it all together. Because of the diversity of opinions in the coalition, I and many others thought it would last only weeks, the government. I thought it was that's a case of predicting wrong. What they have done is to step carefully. Lapid is on record as having told the government, different factions of the government, if you feel you're right about something and it will destroy the cohesiveness of the coalition if you speak out about it, even though you're right, keep quiet. Which to me is that's a horrendous way to govern. There's no governance there. And we have Bennett, who says he's anti-Palestinian state. We have Lapid, who was openly for a Palestinian state and has said so publicly. And Gantz, who is not only for it, but has gone to see Mahmoud Abbas of the PA with Bennett's approval. So who's in charge here and what does the government stand for? It is very, very worrisome to many of us. The big push right now is to hold the government together long enough to pass the budget. It needs 3 readings in the plenum. It's had 1 reading successfully. It needs 2 more. And this has to be done before November 13th or by November 13th. And if this doesn't happen, which has happened before in former governments, the government will fall and there's automatic elections. So they're attempting to tiptoe so nobody leaves the coalition until they at least pass a budget. And the budget is a positive thing, not because I necessarily am thrilled with every single item in the budget, but the government for proper functioning requires a budget. And we haven't had one in years. And it's very complex and very difficult. Now, Mansour Abbas is threatening to bolt on several accounts. And I want to mention 2 or 3 of them because they're important. One is an electricity law. It sounds like a simple thing, and it's not. That's being proposed. This law would give illegal Arab housing in Area C the ability to hook up to the electric grid. And what this does is give them credibility in terms of, are they illegal? Look, if they're hooked up, then maybe they're legal. And this is something to be opposed, and it's something he's pushing for. Another big one is the citizenship law. This was on the floor many weeks ago. It didn't pass. There was a big struggle over it. Very simply, this is something that had been renewed for years. People who were Arabs in the Palestinian Authority who marry Israeli Arabs want to be able to come to Israel and either have permanent residency or citizenship. And there's a law that restricts the numbers. so that with very good reason. The statistics show, first of all, you don't want to be flooded with a lot of additional Arab population, but the statistics show very clearly that there's much more terrorism amongst those who have come from the PA and from their children. I've seen the statistics, I don't have them on hand, but there's reasons for this. But it didn't pass, and now it's being brought forth again. And I want to mention someone who's working on this, someone who I think is really a great guy. His name is Simcha Rotman. He's a member of the Religious Zionist Party, which is headed by Bezalel Smotrich. These are my guys, as far as I'm concerned. They're strongly right-wing. They stand on what they say what they think. I've spoken to Simcha about this. He says that a citizenship law doesn't do it. We need an immigration law. It's shocking. We don't have an immigration law in Israel. And that would involve, the illegal immigrants from Africa and all the rest of it. It would quantify it and legalize everything. And the citizenship part would fold into that. And he wants to bring this forward, and he's working with Ayala Shekhed of the Interior, Ministry of Interior on this. In the meantime, while there's no citizenship law in place, she's been accepting petitions for people who are married to Israelis who want to come and been denying them the right to come. She's holding it off, but they say this can't continue forever. There has to be a law in place. So Rotman and Shekhed agreed to put off work on this immigration law long enough to let the budget pass first. Because if Mansour Abbas should walk on this, then we wouldn't have a budget. But Rotman only agrees to postpone this if they'll put a temporary citizenship law, if they'll pull back the citizenship law that was in place previously and put it in place until they agree on the immigration law. He refuses to allow there to be nothing, that it's floating in the air. So this is a very big issue, and it's coming up. And this is one of the things that Mansour Abbas is fighting. Another hot issue, and I saw some questions about this already, involves illegal Arab housing in Area C and the issue of well, I see Judy, I see your face on that, and the issue of settlements and our ability to continue to develop in Area C, as we should be. In terms of the Arab housing, and this is something I think everybody here knows, it's not this government, it's lots of governments. The civil administration drags their feet pathetically. And there are thousands and thousands of illegal structures, Arab structures in Area C that should be taken down that have not been taken down. And they function under, did you say so? Judy, I can't hear you. You're.
I just barged in and said another good reason for sovereignty, another good argument.
Okay, sure, but you know where I'm operating from? Of course I want sovereignty, but we're not going to get it now. And I want to be realistic and talk about what we can do, just like they want to guarantee that certain things will stay in place so they can have what they want later. We want to make sure we can have the sovereignty in the land later, that we protected our interests sufficiently, that it was time to apply for sovereignty and it'll go through, that things are in a good place. And that's what I'm looking, this is piecemeal, but what I'm looking at is the ability to hold the ground. And I want to mention, because it's so important, is Regavim, because they do I recommend them from top to bottom. They do an absolutely superb job. They are the monitors on what's going on. They take the civil administration to the courts. They have a number of lawyers working for them. They monitor everything that's going on. They have the statistics and how much is being built and all the rest of it. And it pays to follow when they put out op-eds and so forth. Mayor Deutsch is head of it. They do superb work and very, very important work for our future and for our sovereignty. Now, the flip side, of course, is how much are we going to be building in the settlements? now and in immediate time forward. Bennett says he's for building, but I'll believe it when I see it. And there's one particular point I want to make here because it's something people don't always perceive, and it's very, very important. When they announce Jewish building and settlements, they're not enlarging the footprint of the settlement. Almost always, the building is inside of the perimeters of the settlement that already exists. So, okay, there's so many and so many more houses up and so many more people could live there, but the Jewish residency hasn't expanded in Area C. But every time this illegal Arab building goes up, it's new in Area C and it's spreading in a way that the Jewish building is not spreading. So the statistics are a bit deceiving in terms of saying so many houses and so many houses Jewish and Arab, because it's a matter of how much land the Arabs are illegally co-opting with their building. And by the way, they have this other shtick that they establish farms, they put sheep out and stuff, and they say, oh, it's ours now because we're farming on it. And the issue here is how much land they are co-opting. So having said all this, I want to switch to something a little bit different. I think it's important, and I hope you'll agree with me. I feel so strongly, I'm an activist, and I feel very, very strongly that now is the time to fight the good fight. And it's not enough that we know these things, we have to scream them from the rooftops. And it was very interesting because it was so pertinent. Kamala Harris, as you all know, I'm sure, went to hear these students speak, and there was this horrible student who says, you know, Israel's an occupier and apartheid and whatever she said. And Kamala says, oh, your truth has to be heard too. What her truth? It's not truth. But the myth that's promoted is whatever anybody says is truth. And that's where we get caught. And there's so much distortion, and there's so much misrepresentation.
Excuse me, Arlene, what that student said was ethnic genocide.
Okay.
It's so much greater than just, you know.
Okay, okay, but the point is, she wasn't called on it by Kamala, and Kamala called it her.
You need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, Kamala called it your truth. That's the point. And it's not her truth. It's a lie. And she embraced the lie and promoted it. And the vice president of the United States called it a truth. And this is what we are confronting. And what I want to suggest, and I want to go through certain specifics here, is that each of us who cares about these things and is well informed take an activist role now. This means, first of all, for those of you who are Americans, that you keep your congresspeople honest. And you let them know they're looking over their shoulder all the time because of left-wing groups that are pushing them. You got to let them know you're watching them too. And it's got to be consistent. But it's also, if you have contact with kids on college campuses, they hear so much distortion, they have to know the truth too. And then you have to do it in public forums, whether it's letters to the editor or opinion pieces or on your Facebook page or other media platforms. I want to urge that you take the time, not just once, but again and again and again, when you see the lies, that you confront them. And I want to give certain examples and some information you will have had already, and I'm sure some of it will be new to you in terms of things you can do to confront these truths, these lies, and that you should have the truth. You will notice many times that whether it's a boss or someone else speaking for the Palestinian Authority speaks, he will say, international law says that. But they never say which international law, because there is no international law that says that, and they don't have to say it. Simply by invoking international law, it gives what they're saying a gloss of credibility. So what I want to start with here is, hang on 1 second. One particular piece of international law that you may not be familiar with and is called uti possidetis juris. Have you heard of this, many of you? You've heard of it. Many have. Judy, you have. Uti possidetis juris. And what this says, and this is international law, that a newly established state is presumed to have the same borders it had immediately before independence. This means Israel as a state has the borders that the mandate had. Now, there are a lot of people who know about the mandate but say that's old hat. We haven't had it around for a whole lot of years. Who cares about the mandate? What uti possidetis juris does is bring it into the present and make it applicable now in terms of what the borders were. And I think that's an enormously important thing. Israel declared independence in 1948, one day or less than a day after Britain walked away from the mandate, pulled out. So the mandate was the border, and the mandate said from the river to the sea, it was the entire area was of Palestine was, according to the mandate, for a Jewish homeland. And according to uti possidetis juris, then, this is Israel's border, and all of Judea and Samaria legally belongs to us. This is very powerful and very important. But the Arabs like to refer to another border, in quotes, and you of course know this, the 1967 border. And that excludes Judea and Samaria. And they're forever insisting, which is what Abbas did, that we have to move back behind that line because that's legal. But there never was any such border. And this is, again, you may know it, but unless the people who hear Abbas and the others say it, know it, we're losing because they believe him. So it falls upon us to state that this is a lie, this is not so. What there was, of course, was an Armistice Line. And that was from 1949 until the first half, almost the first half of 67. But what is an Armistice Line? It's simply a demarcation of where hostilities ended between two belligerent forces. It showed where Jordan and Israel stopped fighting, and they drew up an armistice agreement, and that's the Armistice Line. But I want you to hear, because people need to know this, what it says in the Armistice, said in the Armistice Agreement, that this line was agreed upon, quote, without prejudice to future boundary lines. And this was put in by Jordan because they hoped to push Israel back. And they didn't want to recognize this as being a permanent line. So there's anyone who knows the honest history and the legality of it, no one who knows it can say that this is a border that Israel must be behind. It simply isn't so. And I think we are remiss if we don't let people know these things. It may seem simple and primary to many of us, but you'll find if you went out and asked people on the street, most people wouldn't know. And I want to suggest it's important that we start letting people know these things. Now, actually, by the middle of June of early June of 1967, there was no more Armistice Line either. Because when Jordan attacked Israel in the Six-Day War, they breached the Armistice Line and thereby abrogated the whole agreement. So there's nothing there legally, and yet it's invoked against us. After the war, the Security Council passed Resolution 242, which called for recognized boundaries to be determined via negotiations. On the east, recognized boundaries were understood to be between Israel and Jordan. And this is something else that should be made clear. There was no reference in 242 to either a Palestinian people or a Palestinian state. Israel was not told, negotiate with the Palestinians to see where their state can be. It was between Israel and Jordan. And it took a lot of years, but in 1994, a peace treaty was drawn up between Israel and Jordan. And the treaty states explicitly that, and this is a quote again, the international boundary between Israel and Jordan is delimited with reference to the boundary definition under the mandate. In other words, our boundary with Jordan is the Jordan River legally. And this is international law because whenever two parties on two sides of a line agree that that's where the line is, it becomes international law. People don't know any of this. And I put it to each of you, and I asked you to put it to others to promote the proper information on these things. Then there's one more thing in this respect that I also want to raise. Mahmoud Abbas just said very recently that if we won't agree to go back to the 67 borders, he's going to start promoting another solution, in quotes, the partition plan from 1947. A real no-starter. But this keeps on rearing its head every now and then. But everybody, again, should know the partition plan is null and void. It's a dead letter. The first thing people don't know is that Resolution 181, which alluded to this thing that's called the partition plan, did not simply divide Palestine between an Arab state and a Jewish state, which is what everybody thinks. It was supposed to be an economic union with two democracies. The Palestinian state had to be a democracy as well, according to 181. And they were supposed to be joined in many ways in terms of currency, transportation system, postal system, et cetera, et cetera. Israel said yes, but Israel said yes, predicated legally on the acceptance that the other side would accept all the parameters. Israel didn't just say, yes, okay, we'll agree to step back and let the Arabs have a state and part of this land. They had to be a democracy, they had a this, and obviously that never happened. And I note further that the proposal was a General Assembly resolution, and this is very important as well, because General Assembly resolutions have no weight and are not legally binding. It only would have been legally binding if both sides agreed, and that didn't happen. And the fact of the matter is the Arabs rejected the proposal. They not only refused to accept it, the record shows they didn't accept the authority of the UN to make such a proposal. Why? Because they were offended by the idea that they should have to share any part of Palestine with the Jews. And that's on record. And yet, every now and then, as Abbas just did, they bring it up again as if our agreement to go on board with this still exists and that they have a right to hook into it at any point they want. And this is also a matter, finally on this, a matter of international law. One who rejects an agreement does not retain any rights based on that agreement. This was a finding at the International Court of Justice. The Arabs said no, they have no legal right to go back and now say, we want to consider it. It just doesn't play. Now, the report in which I read this, and this is the last thing I want to mention on this, is that when Abbas said this to Gantz, when Gantz met with him, Gantz went to Ramallah and met with Abbas with the permission of the prime minister. And reportedly Gantz said he believes in a two-state solution and he'd like to be the new Yitzhak Rabin. Now Gantz's office said, well, that wasn't exactly what he said, but it's close enough that it gives me the chance to bring up one other issue. Whenever people want to promote a Palestinian state, they like to evoke Yitzhak Rabin's support of it, but he didn't support it. And that's something else people don't know. And his last statement to the Knesset, he said he envisioned something less than a full sovereign state. He envisioned some sort of autonomy for the Palestinians. And I want to stop here for 1 minute because I think it's an important point. Someone asked me earlier. I'm against the two-state solution. What am I for? We have to do something with these people. And my own response, and it's certainly not mine alone, is some sort of autonomy. Autonomy meaning we retain sovereignty to the land, and they have authority to govern within whatever the parameters of that autonomous unit is for local matters. They can do local municipal elections, they can run their own schools, etc. But the land remains ours. I think, I don't know when or if this will happen, but I think that's probably the most viable of the many suggestions that are out there, floating out there. Okay. I want to go now because it's also something that the Arabs use against us a lot. They like to make charges about Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, when they talk about Al-Aqsa, they refer to the mosque on the Temple Mount, and they also call the whole mount Al-Aqsa, and sometimes it's a little vague about which one they're talking about. But they say it's all theirs, and we have no claims on it, and we're only up there to threaten them, and they have to protect the mosque and Al-Aqsa from us. There's a vast amount of information on the fact that we have primary claim to it. We had 2 temples there, but I want to provide you with a couple of very succinct and pertinent pieces of information, some of which you probably don't know, and which I think is very good for making the case. When you make the case, you have to do it succinctly. You can't write an essay, and these are the kinds of bullet pieces of information that can be helpful. There was, in 1925, the Supreme Muslim Council published a 9-page English language tourist guide entitled A Brief Guide to Al-Haram Al-Sharif. That's the Temple Mount. And it stated that the temple site is, in quotes, one of the oldest in the world. Its sanctity dates from the earliest times. Its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. That's what the Arabs said back in 1925. They've changed their tune a bit. Now, I don't know if I mentioned it or not. I mentioned my website, but what I want you to know is all of this information is on my website. I put it on there on purpose.
Arlene,
Yes.
would you like to stop and take some questions from me?
I'm almost done.
Okay, all right.
I'm almost done. I'm passionate about this, and I will stop in a
see,
minute.
I know.
Okay, so the point is, it's there, and I have one other thing here that I absolutely love. In the 1930s, there was renovation work done on Al-Aqsa Mosque, and beneath the mosque, they found the remains of a Byzantine mosaic floor, which may have been the floor of a church. Beneath that was found a mikveh. Underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a mikveh. This is something that should be used. And the Dutch biblical archaeologist, who's not Jewish, Dr. Leen Rittmeyer, says this proves the Jewish origins of the Temple Mount. Now, there's a lot more I could say. I'm happy to take questions, but you will find all of this. It's called Fighting with Facts. It's on my homepage on the sidebar on the left. You can access all this information with reference to where it came from. Please use it. I think this is very, very important information in terms of fighting the fight, and please fight the fight. Okay? Yes.
All right, so we have a lot of very good questions, and that was a wonderful overview of the information that you are
I
imparting.
could just
to
keep
us.
going, but okay.
I know you could, but
Okay, I know I have to stop.
we're
I know.
scheduled for an hour, and people do want to ask questions.
Okay, now let me say something else. If you go onto my website, there's a way to write to me. And if you haven't gotten to me here, you can write to me and I will do my very best, unless I get deluged with so many that I can't attend to it. People who are my readers know I answer them. If they ask serious questions, I take the time to answer them. And if I don't know the answer, I try to get it. So please be assured of that I'm open to questions. Okay.
Okay, so we have a question from Leon's Medra, which I think is really important in terms of the two-state solution and the ability of Israel to have a unified Jerusalem. There have been plans to build 3,500 homes in Mevaseret Adumim, which is E1, for many years. They were deposited, I think, in 2020. So the Israeli government is planning to vote on this on October 18th. What are your thoughts on this vote and how important it is? And if it's voted down, what happens?
Nothing happens. I think it will be voted down, given the nature of the government. See, the problem is, which I try to explain, here you have, he should hang his head in shame. Gideon Saar for the New Hope party is supposed to be a right-wing party. But all these people are afraid to destroy that. Now, Gideon Saar is functioning as justice minister. He doesn't want to give this up. They tiptoe as to not upset the left-wing members, the left-wing factions of the coalition. Given the nature of that, I don't see this going through. I'm very pained by all of this. I'm angry about this. I don't like my government, but that's what
it does leave room for a contiguous Palestinian state if the building doesn't happen in E1. So it's a really critical.
It's all part of what I was talking about here.
Right.
All part of it. And I wish, I pray, we are not strong enough for ourselves. We need to believe in ourselves, stand up. Now, it just happened, and I didn't raise this, but I almost had a heart attack when I saw it. The High Court, which is also one of our problems, came out with a suggested solution to the Shimon HaTzadik housing issue. And there is something about that on my website separately, but that they let the Arabs stay there for 15 years. And I'm saying, what is this? It's Jewish houses. It was proved. And they're always tiptoeing not to upset the Arabs. I deplore it, but that's what is. And we have to fight it every way we can fight it. That's why I said we're not going to have sovereignty tomorrow. We have to keep fighting everything we can as much as we can. I hope that answers it.
Helene?
Yeah, I'm going through this, and we have a lot of statements, not necessarily questions. So I'm going through this to see, and I think the question.
Bernice Lipkin asked a good question.
I'm trying to find.
Bernice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Isn't anyone worried that the Arabs are conforming to Hammond's rule on how Arabs take over a host country as they increase in number?
Of course people are worried, but that's one of the reasons for not allowing Arabs who come from the Palestinian Authority but marry Israeli Arabs to come in and become citizens and make lots of more Arabs in the country. Of course there's a concern about that. It goes without saying.
Okay. Just a point to be brought up.
Yes.
So Arlene, I actually have a question.
Yes, please.
With regard to your ideas about what to do, because I personally think sovereignty would help us a lot.
How would you get there now?
Right. Well,
That's
the first issue is that whenever I talk to European representatives, they say, we don't really care about these things because the Israelis don't make a stink. They don't make a stink when illegal,
I agree.
building happens.
I agree.
So getting Israel itself, because I'm still a foreigner, despite my Jewish and Israel advocacy. I'm still a foreigner. I don't vote. I don't pay taxes there. You guys need to be more vocal. But I was interested in your perception of what could be done at some point if we ever get there in terms of schools. I'm very frightened about what gets taught and why the Israelis have not overseen the education of these kids, because the last stats that I saw said that nearly 60% of Arabs are believing, Arab Palestinians believe that an armed struggle is appropriate.
Wait, armed Arab Palestinians or Arab Israelis?
Arab Palestinians.
We can't control what's taught in their schools.
But if
Fighting
you
for
own the
UNWRA.
land, you do. You have a little bit of oversight.
How do we UNWRA is the only avenue to fighting this. I had a fight with this with Barkat, when he was mayor, because there were schools inside of Jerusalem, Arab-run schools that were still teaching bad things about Israel. And I said, you can't allow this. You're mayor of Jerusalem. Well, we have to educate the parents slowly. They'll come around when they see we have better schools. And I couldn't convince him otherwise. And he didn't like it. I was very pushy. And that's how I saw it. But for the most part, when it comes to UNRWA schools, we can do, David Bedin does a wonderful job on this. And he's the one I should mention on this in terms of promoting what happens in the schools in UNRWA, and UNRWA runs all these schools, but is the Israeli government cannot control all of that. I'm more concerned, I thought you were going to say something else, that Israeli Jewish kids should be taught that the land is ours, and whether they are or not depends on what school they go to. See, the religious kids know this, but not everybody does. And I was shocked when I first came here. It was incomprehensible to me. There are Israelis who've never been in Jerusalem, grew up in the north or somewhere, and they never came to. How could you not come to Jerusalem? It's the most holy, wonderful city in the whole world, and it's ours, and you never came here? I'm more worried about that. I'm not worried about what will hit us from the outside. My concern is our internal strength and our ability to stand up for ourselves, which is why I love the Religious Zionist Party. I wish they could run the country.
Has there been more pushback about, I mean, for me, Ram, I look at the Muslim Brotherhood is in your midst, and where there has not been any real pushback from people who obviously accepted this as an okay coalition.
I don't think they necessarily saw it as okay, but it's legal. It shouldn't have happened. It's a shanda that it happened. It happened. The whole thing has been painful to me for years, and I'm being absolutely honest, that because they didn't like Bibi, somebody like Sar would prefer, he hates Bibi so much, he'd rather go with a Muslim who's a jihadist in the government than with Bibi and what would have been a right-wing Zionist government.
It is painful.
Huh?
It is painful.
I'm pained a lot of the time. I don't pretend otherwise, and I'm being very honest about it because I think we have to be honest at this point. It's painful.
I've had a question for a long time, and Amalia is asking the question too.
Yeah.
Does becoming an Israeli citizen require, the way in America it does require, a pledge to support the country? So that
I don't believe it's quite the same as it is in America. And what bothers me, again, we have not just the Ram party, but we have other parties that are not in the government, but are in the Knesset, who are anti-Israel. And I want to quote one thing, and I just spoke to an associate of mine about this. There was a big flack recently because Ben Gavir called Tibi a terrorist on the floor of the Knesset. And people said, he's anti-Arab and racist, and how dare he say this? And I said, he's telling the truth. Tibi was an advisor to Arafat. And I've asked myself forever, what is wrong with us that we allow a man who advised Arafat to sit in our Knesset? So we bend over backwards to show that we're accepting and blah, blah, blah. And I think we do ourselves harm.
I agree.
And I'm on Ben Gavir's side. You know?
We have a question from Vivian Ziner. And
Okay.
she wants to know, how can we repackage our PR to be effective? We have to learn to speak to those we are losing, like Jews in the diaspora, who buy into the Palestinian narrative.
Okay, well, I think that's what I was trying to talk about today. I've learned the lesson, and it was a very hard lesson, that you have to cut your losses. There's some people who are so anti-Israel, you just get heartache and run your head into the wall, and it's not worth it. You have to go after those who are open enough to maybe hearing another side, plant seeds that say, I always thought they said this, but now you say this, maybe it's not like I thought it was, and thank you for the information. And I think doing it with facts, the kinds of facts I gave today, more on my website, and to bring facts, and I think we have not been nearly vocal enough. We've been too passive. We're heartbroken. We're upset. We're angry. We're not fighting back hard enough. And I have this longing to see the good fight fought, because that's the only way there's a chance to win.
And I'm going to rephrase Nissan Hershkowitz's question just a little bit, because it really isn't a question. What can we do to challenge the canard that in 1948, Israel conquered the ancient Palestinian people, and to really, change the narrative to the Israeli liberation?
Well, I could
narrative.
bring a whole other set of facts, which could do it. We can talk about the PLO. There was no Palestinian people before a certain very recent time before the founding of Israel. They talked about themselves as Southern
The
Syria.
charter was 1964. The PLO
Yes.
charter was 1964.
Thank you, yes. And it was started by the Egyptians. It wasn't started by Palestinian Arabs. And Arafat was an Egyptian, which I love that. People don't know that. And I read once that Palestinian Arabs didn't like the way he spoke Arabic because it was Egyptian Arabic. He didn't speak like them, but he's the leader of the Palestinian people. If you pull it apart and bring forward some very concrete, specific historical facts. And again, what I find, if you write great big essays, no one will listen. You have to hit them with bullet points and succinct points that say, that's true. That's the way it was. That before Israel was founded, what is today the Jerusalem Post was called the Palestine Post, because it was the Jews that were Palestinians, not Arabs. People don't know these things. And some of them are such simple things, and knowing them can start to shift perceptions. And we have been way, way too passive. You agree?
If I may interject, I think it's important that we never say the Palestinians. I always say
You heard me. I always say Palestinian Arab. I didn't say Palestinians once. I agree. I identify them as Palestinian Arabs, because that's all. I never say the Palestinians.
Well, we are, yes, and AFC has a policy of never saying Palestinians. We also always say Palestinian Arabs, even though Egyptians aren't really Arabs, and it gets a little confusing, but we do say Palestinian Arabs.
I think we need to keep it simple where we can, because it resonates better.
Exactly. You have to just overlook some of the little. In any event, there is so we're about 2:01, so we're running a little bit over. People are generally able to stay on, but I see that some people have to hop off. It's lunch hour.
Okay.
But we really want to thank you.
You're very
we want to
welcome.
repeat to all of our viewers that there is such a wealth of information on. It's not a typical blog. It's like a website that has articles, but also a lot of permanent information that you can get to. And it's Arlene from Israel.info.
Thank you.
Please use it. And, we want to see a resurgence, after all this COVID time where we've been hidden away in our homes, it's time to get active again.
Thank you. I certainly agree. And thank you for having me. And thank you for everybody who listened and who asked questions. And I'm available to those who want to ask more questions on my website.
So thank you very, very much to everybody. And signing off from New York, and wishing everybody a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, shalom.